History, often, doesn't begin with a plan or a declaration, but with an act of violence so sudden and brutal that it redefines the world for all who come after. For 8th century Europe, that act happened on a summer day, in one of the most sacred and unlikely of places, June 8, 793. On the northeastern coast of England, the low tide revealed a causeway to the holy island of Lindisfarne. The site was more than a monastery. It was one of the most revered centers of Christendom, a beacon of knowledge and faith. There, monks dedicated their lives to prayer and the creation of illuminated manuscripts, like the famous Lindisfarne Gospels. It was a place of absolute peace, protected not by walls, but by its own sanctity. Months earlier, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle had recorded terrifying omens. Lightning, whirlwinds, and what were described as fiery dragons were seen flying through the skies of Northumbria. To the men of the time, they were signs of a coming calamity, but no one could imagine the form it would take. On that June day, the omen took shape on the horizon. Silhouettes of ships appeared on the North Sea, different from anything the locals knew. They were not the wide, slow merchant ships that frequented the coast. These were long, narrow, and terribly fast, with their high prows carved in the shape of dragon heads that seemed to bite the waves. For a brief moment there was confusion, but when the ships slid onto the beach and their occupants disembarked, the confusion gave way to dread. They were not traders. They were tall men, armed with axes and swords, who moved with an organized ferocity. They ran toward the monastery, a target that, for any Christian, would be unthinkable to attack. The massacre was swift and merciless. The monks, unarmed and defenseless, were cut down at the altars and in the courtyards. Sacred treasures, accumulated for centuries, were looted. Gold crosses, silver chalices, and the jewel-studded covers of the Gospels were ripped away and thrown into sacks. The sanctuary, one of the holiest places in Britain, was desecrated, stripped, and set on fire. The news of the attack spread through Europe like a poison, transmitted in shocked letters and terrified whispers. From the court of the great Emperor Charlemagne, the scholar Alcuin of York wrote to an English bishop. In his words, "We feel the impact of the event. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as what we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain has been given as prey to pagan peoples." The attack on Lindisfarne was more than a simple act of piracy in search of silver. It was a declaration, the scream that announced the beginning of a new and terrible era. And in every castle and church in Christendom, a terrified question echoed: who were these men? From where, exactly, did this fury from the sea come? To answer the question, where did they come from, we must leave the smoking ruins of Lindisfarne and travel north, to the land these men called home, Iron Age Scandinavia, a region shaped by ice, with coastlines carved by deep fjords, dense forests, and mountains that plunged directly into the cold sea. Arable land was a scarce and contested commodity, a limited resource that dictated the rhythms of life and death. Here, the sea was not a barrier, but the main highway, the source of food, and the most vital connection to the outside world. The men who attacked Lindisfarne did not call themselves Vikings. That term, in the Old Norse language, described an activity, the act of going on a sea expedition, usually to raid. They were Norse peoples, divided into groups we know today as Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes. Their identity was not national, but local. Loyalty was devoted to the family, the clan, and the tribal chief, the Jarl, who ruled over a farm or a small territory. The popular image of primitive barbarians is a fiction created by their victims. In reality, the Scandinavians were efficient farmers who worked the land diligently to survive in a relentless climate. They were masters of metallurgy, forging high-quality iron tools and weapons. Their society, though frequently violent, had laws and institutions, such as the Thing, an assembly of free men where legal disputes were resolved, and important decisions for the community were made. And, crucially, before they were known as raiders, they were known as traders. For centuries, they navigated vast and complex trade routes. From their ports, they took furs, amber, and precious walrus ivory to the south, trading them for Arab silver, silk from Asia, spices and glass from the Frankish Empire. They were already world travelers, with a geographic knowledge that stretched from the Arctic to Constantinople. They knew that to the south, there were kingdoms immensely richer than their own. To understand the explosion that was to come, one must understand their mindset. Personal honor was the most valuable asset. Fame, the reputation a man left after his death, was the only true immortality. And wealth, mainly silver, was the visible proof of a leader's success, strength, and power. A Jarl could only maintain the loyalty of his warriors if he could reward them with generous gifts. Silver was not just money. It was the social glue that guaranteed power and honor. This was Scandinavia before the Fury, a complex, skilled and ambitious society, pressured by a difficult land and driven by the need for glory and wealth. They already possessed the knowledge of the world and the culture of boldness. The specific catalysts that would transform their trade potential into a force of invasion were missing. Scandinavian society contained great potential for expansion. This potential was unleashed by a combination of specific factors that occurred in a short period. These catalysts, together, created the necessary conditions for the beginning of the Viking Age. The first and most important catalyst was technological. The development of the longship, also known as the longskip. Its construction was unique for the era. The hull was made with a technique of overlapping oak planks, called clinker, which made it strong and flexible for sailing on the open sea. At the same time, its draft was very shallow, less than a meter deep. This allowed the ship to navigate shallow rivers and beach directly on shores, eliminating the need for built ports. The combination of a large square sail for speed and a row of oars for quick maneuvers gave this vessel unprecedented versatility. It was a vehicle capable of transporting troops quickly, attacking by surprise, and retreating before an effective defense could be organized. This vessel gave the Scandinavians the ability to project their military power over long distances. The second catalyst was a series of socio-economic pressures in Scandinavia itself. Archaeological data from cemeteries and settlements indicate a significant population increase during the 8th century. This growth placed severe pressure on agricultural lands, which were already limited by the region's geography. Added to this, inheritance practices often favored the eldest son who received the family farm. Younger sons were left with few or no prospects of owning their own land. For these young men, seeking fortune abroad became a necessity to achieve social status and economic independence. The third catalyst was the perception of opportunities abroad. Through their trade routes, the Scandinavians had direct knowledge of the wealth of the kingdoms to the south. Monasteries in England, Ireland, and Francia were centers of great accumulation of silver and gold in the form of liturgical objects, and they had no military defenses. They were high-value low-risk targets. Politically, Europe was also vulnerable. England was fragmented into several rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Carolingian Empire, after the death of Charlemagne in the early 9th century, began a long process of disintegration and civil war. This internal instability made them easy targets for swift and well-organized external attacks. These factors combined. Tribal chiefs in Scandinavia needed wealth to maintain the loyalty of their followers and consolidate their power. The invasion of rich and poorly defended targets became the most effective method to acquire the necessary silver. The activity of raiding, or going a Viking, evolved from an alternative to a central economic and political strategy for many Scandinavian leaders. It all was formed by an ambitious society, a new naval technology, and a vulnerable neighboring continent. The Viking Age was not a spontaneous event, but the logical result of a series of conditions that reached a critical point at the end of the 8th century. The Scandinavian culture provided the motivation, a search for honor and wealth. The internal pressures, like overpopulation and inheritance laws, created the manpower. A generation of young men willing to risk everything. The political instability of Europe provided the perfect target, and the longship the Draka provided the method. With this equation in mind, the attack on Lindisfarne in 793 ceases to be a random act of barbarism and reveals itself as an almost logical enterprise. Why Lindisfarne? Because it was the ideal target. It was an island, which made it vulnerable to an amphibious attack and difficult to defend by land armies. It was inhabited by monks, men of peace with no military training, and most importantly, it was a center of pilgrimage and royal patronage, which meant its walls held an extraordinary amount of wealth in the form of gold, silver, and jewels. For the Norse warriors, who did not share the Christian reverence for holy places, the monastery was not a house of God. It was a poorly guarded vault. The choice of Lindisfarne was therefore an act of tactical intelligence. The impact of the attack, however, went far beyond the material value stolen. To the mentality of Christian Europe, the act was almost incomprehensible. War had rules, and one of them was respect for holy sites. By massacring unarmed monks and looting a church, the Norsemen announced themselves not just as pirates, but as lawless and amoral pagans. This psychological shock was a powerful weapon. The terror they inspired spread faster than any army, creating a reputation that preceded them and often paralyzed their enemies before a battle even began. The image of the Viking as a demon coming from the sea was forged in the blood shed on the altars of Lindisfarne. The success of that first great raid created an irreversible catalytic effect in Scandinavia. Imagine the scene, the return of those first ships to a Norwegian fjord. They did not return with furs or amber, but with gleaming silver, wrought gold, fine fabrics, and slaves. For a community where a leader's wealth determined his status and power, the impact was immense. The expedition validated the risk. It proved that the wealth that took a lifetime to accumulate through farming and trade could be won in a single bold raiding season. This opened the floodgates. Success bred imitation. Young men who previously had no prospects saw a new path to glory and fortune. Local chiefs who needed resources to compete with their rivals began to finance and organize their own fleets. What began as sporadic small-scale raids, known as Strongjaeg lightning raids on the beach, quickly evolved. In a few decades, the fleets became larger, the armies more numerous. The strategy changed from simple hit-and-run to more complex operations. The Vikings began to establish winter camps in enemy territory, such as in England and Francia, allowing them to attack for longer and deeper into the continent. Eventually, Raids for plunder gave way to the extortion of tribute, the infamous Danegeld, where entire kingdoms paid enormous sums of silver for the Vikings to go away. And, finally, extortion gave way to conquest and colonization, with Viking armies taking lands and settling permanently, as they did in Normandy, England, and Russia. Therefore, June 8, 793, was not the day the Viking people were born. They already existed, with their skills, their culture, and their ambitions. That was the day they announced themselves to the rest of the world. Lindisfarne was not the cause of the Viking Age, it was its prologue. It was the visible result of pressures that had been accumulating for generations and that, once unleashed, would not only plunder Europe, but redesign it. For the next 300 years, these men from the north would become the most dynamic force in the world, leaving their trail as traders, explorers, settlers, and conquerors from North America to the steppes of Asia. The history of the origin of the Vikings shows us that great historical eras rarely arise from nothing. They are the result of a complex interaction between culture, technology, social pressure, and opportunity. Did you already know the factors that led to the beginning of the Viking Age? What surprised you more, the sophistication of their society before the invasions or the genius of their naval design? What other great era of history, like the Age of Pirates or the Age of Discovery, would you like to see unraveled in a future video? Leave your suggestion in the comments and remember, the next adventure begins with you.